I have a bunch of natural birch cutoffs that are approximately 2 by 4 inch and approximately a couple feet long. They're natural birch. It's called natural birch because it combines both the sapwood and the heartwood. The heartwood is the dark, sometimes called red birch, and the sapwood is the white, sometimes called white birch. But this was sold as natural birch because it just lets the color variation stay, and I think it makes for a better looking board once you expose the end grain. So I just picked out a bunch of these pieces and started milling them, firstly by taking them to the table saw and cutting them into nearly 2-inch squares, about 1 3/4 squares. And once I had that done, I started my glue up. So I started gluing these together. Just use Titebond 2. I tend to put wood or glue on both pieces of wood on something like this where I want a really, really good bond, and I don't want any gaps or any failure in the glue up. So I put it on both pieces using just a glue brush, spreading a nice coat on both pieces, and then applying those to each other. And then as I just went down the board, I again just continued to apply to both pieces, just using a glue brush. Nothing special about this. I just wanted to make sure I got a really, really good glue up, because an end grain board, you're really relying on that glue, and you're just really relying on the end grain, everything holding together, because I would say they're in some ways they're rather fragile, and so I tried to get a really, really good glue up. Use some pipe clamps to secure this all together and let it go overnight to get a really nice tight glue up. I just was able to pick the whole thing up, lean it against the wall, and wait till the next day. Once I let that cure, I pulled my clamps off, and then the next thing I had to do, oh, by the way, this is about a 13-inch square. I trimmed it down to 13 inches. Why was I shooting for 13 inches? Because that's the size of my planer, and I was going to run these glued surfaces through the planer. Here I'm doing that because they are going to become the next glued surfaces, and I needed them to be perfectly parallel and perfectly flat. So once I had run those through the planer, I was able to then take them to my cross-cutting sled and cut them into rows of glue ups, again maintaining the square size. So these rows I was cutting was also about 1 3/4 to match the size of or the depth, you could say, of the wood. Then I kind of put them together sort of every other way. I had a half of a square at the end, so I just turned them every other way so that I got a little bit more of an interesting surface, and glued those up the same way I did the last ones, same clamps, same everything, waited for that to dry, and then I had the challenge of leveling the board, which I think was probably the most difficult. And so I went about that in a kind of a homemade, hokey way that ended up working perfectly for me. Here's a real quick illustration. I basically taped the board down to my table, put a little shim under it where it was rocking a little bit, ripped a couple of bars to go beside it, and I clamped those down, then took another board and made sort of a homemade router holder out of it. Just simply drilled out the holes to meet my router base, and had this leveling bit. Here's the real deal. Totally homemade, took minutes to put together. But because those ripped boards were level and because the board was level, I was able to take my plunge router, push it down to the surface of the board, and for the first pass at least, just slid that around on the board. Maybe all at this point, all I was taking off was probably just a little bit of glue squeeze out. Maybe ever so slightly I was taking a little bit of the board down. But as I went, because it's a plunge router, I would take the plunge router depth adjuster, and between passes I would simply lower the plunge router to a very scientific depth of 2 old business cards. I use business cards as shims all the time. In fact, you can see them in the corner of the lower left corner of the board, holding that board level as I leveled the first side of the board. So again, I just ran this router around on the surface of the board, stuck a couple of business cards into the depth adjuster, and lowered the plunge router, which would be the equivalent of about a 1/16 of an inch, and made more passes. Here's the highly technical business card adjustment. And I would just make another pass, and it would take off just ever so little bit of surface, but it was getting better and better as I went. And so I just kept doing that, lowering it as I went. After that side was level, I taped it to the table and went to the other side of the board and had my level board. Next came sanding, and I started with 80 grit. I like this sandpaper that 3M makes. It's called Extract, X-T-R-A-C-K or C-T. It's really aggressive sandpaper. It doesn't clog up. It uses sort of a screen mesh. I'll show you a picture of that in a moment. There it is. That's the 80 grit. I'd do 80 grit for a while, and then I went to 150 grit. I was not satisfied with how fast that was taking it down, so I resorted to a couple of cabinet scrapers, a Stanley 80 and a Stanley 20, and tried that for a while. Still wasn't totally satisfied. Was wondering why I was having so much trouble sanding down this end grain, and I mean the reason is pretty obvious, because it's end grain, and birch is a pretty hard wood, and it was getting to be almost frustrating that I just could not seem to get a really good feel when you ran your hand across it, and it also had sort of these end grain marks in it. I watched a video of a guy wetting the surface in order to swell the grain or even soften the grain. So I tried that. I wetted the surface down with denatured alcohol and then ran my 80 grit paper over it. And I was actually pleasantly surprised that it did end up taking the little tiny imperfections out of the board. I just worked that over and over again. One thing that does happen when you wet the board, obviously, is the paper wants to clog. Here now I'm switching to the 150 grit. This is more of a sanding screen. Again, it's that same brand. And vacuumed off the back of my sander because the hook and loop starts to not work very well as it clogs. And so continued to run that over until I was happy with the surface. Then I used a 1/2 inch roundover bit in my plunge router. Again, slowly lowered down onto the project in order to get a nice rounded over edge. Tiny bit of burning happened there, but that was easily sanded off. I rounded over one side, rounded over the second side, and I think I had a pretty good finished shape for my cutting board. Ran a little sandpaper around those edges, a little bit of a final sanding, and then I went to my cutting board balm, which is simply 3 parts mineral oil, 1 part beeswax. It's nice and oily because of that 3-to-1 mixture, and you're able to rub a ton of it on the surface and rub it in and continue rubbing in one spot, really laying it on thick. And you can see how quickly the grain, because it's end grain, the grain would soak that in, and you'd start getting a very nice rich look. And again, because this was natural birch, so you had heartwood and sapwood, you got these great patterns. You got this great color variation as the oil and the beeswax sunk into the wood. So I slowly worked on the whole board, really laying it on thick and working it into the board and just laying it on time and time again, wiping it off, laying it on again. And it didn't take long to get the whole board nicely treated with this mineral oil and beeswax finish. The board turned out very smooth to the touch. I did the sides of the board as well, and here it is finished. A great looking end grain natural birch cutting board. Hope you've enjoyed this video. If so, please subscribe. Thanks for watching.